Hello and welcome to the Professing Alls. My name is Ryan, and today we are getting back into Greek. Now, we're just using the nouns and the verbs that we've already learnt, so we're not going to be learning any new vocab today, but we're going to be learning a new form of the verb, not the verb, the noun, sorry. We're dealing with verbs and nouns at the same time, which is really good because it's very important. So that way you're building up your proficiency and understanding of different concepts. But it's important to take it step by step. Now, in this sentence here, this is good English. If I say, I show Peter, so for example, if I saw a good sight, I saw a good mountain, and I wanted to show Peter the mountain, I could say, I showed Peter what I saw yesterday, okay? Now, if I just simply say, I show Peter in English, you might be tempted to think, well, it's after the verb, so therefore it is the object. But if Peter is the object here, what you're actually saying is you're showing Peter. Peter is the thing that's being shown. So if you put in the passive, it helps you to identify the fact that if that is the object, then that's the thing that's being shown, okay? So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and you can't say that in Greek. So if I said, for example, what is it? Dilo Petron, for example, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Greek, because you're basically showing Peter. Why are you showing Peter? But rather, you show something to Peter. Okay, so that, in this case, Peter would be an indirect object if you want to actually say that you're showing something to Peter. Okay, now the way that you do this is really, really simple. Is you do this. You swap the Omicron and Sigma. So you have the Omicron Sigma that used to be there with Petros, or Omicron Ni with Petron, and you put an omega with an iota subscript. So historically, it probably used to be written like so, but at some point, the Omicron probably lengthened to an omega, and because that's really awkward, the omega contracts with the iota to create the iota subscript. Now, this is probably because there's, during the time of Alexander the Great, when all these Greek city-states are starting to use the same language, there are probably some that use this form. There are probably some that just use an omega. And so the Omicron and omega would become one letter. And because an omega with an iota doesn't make a whole lot of sense, phonetically in Greek, the iota just becomes a subscript to show that historically there used to be an iota there, but it's not really there anymore. So, Dilo Petro means I show to Peter. Okay, now this is where αυτό can come in handy. So you can say αυτό, I show it to Peter. Now, you don't need dilo αυτό Petro. You can always say dilo Petro αυτό, I show to Peter it. It makes the same sense in Greek, doesn't matter where it falls. And notice the root form was αυτό, and this form is αυτό as well. So whether αυτό is the subject or an object, it is going to be the same. It's not going to change. Okay? So if I was to say it, I don't know, it sees me, for example, or it sees Peter, αυτό would still be αυτό. So αυτό βλέπει, it sees. Okay? So it's not going to change. Or if I say I see it, it's still going to be βλέπω αυτό. So αυτό doesn't change. So it makes it nice and easy. Now, like I said, neuter nouns follow similar patterns to the masculine forms. Okay? So if αυτό was actually the indirect object, it would do the exact same thing. So if I wanted to show, I show it to it, it's really bad English, but this is the only neuter pronoun I'm showing you at the moment. But if I wanted to say that, I'd say αυτό αυτό. Okay? So, δηλώ αυτό. I show it to it. Okay? It's really bad English, but it's okay Greek depending on what the pronouns are and what the nouns are. Okay? So, this is very important for the verb to show because you're showing something to someone or to something. Now, Jesus, like I said last week, is a little bit different, okay? So the root form is Isus, okay? Now, if Jesus becomes the direct object, then you have a ni. But if you have an indirect object, that omega iota kind of will contract into the omicron epsilon, and so all you need is that, isu. So it just really simplifies down to that. So if you want to say, and it doesn't have to be just show, okay? God sends an angel to Jesus, okay? Let's use that, okay? Theos, debi, angelon, Isu. So God sends an angel to Jesus, okay? So most nouns will have, so if I was to say God sends an angel to Peter, it'd be Petro, or if it was Philip, it'd be Filippo. So usually you'd have that omega iota subscript, but Jesus is the only exception here. Okay? Now, you may have noticed here, the accent has changed a little bit. So it went from, whoops. So it has a consonant, apparently. So you have Philip in the root form, which is Philippos. Whoops. Okay. And if you wanted to go into the direct object, it'd be Philippon. Okay. The accent doesn't change. But here, to go to Filippo, it actually does change. So in Greek, the last syllable tells you where an accent can fall. Okay, so an acute accent can fall on any of the last three syllables. So imagine this is the last syllable, this is the second to last, and this is the third to last, okay? So the acute can fall on any of those. Whoops, that's a graph, but let's just deal with the acute. And the circumflex can go on the last two. Now, if the vowel is short, it can do all of that, okay? So short vowels include alpha, omicron, epsilon, sometimes alpha iota. These are kind of your main ones. Sometimes iota by itself. And then your longer vowels, however, forces a retreat. So if you have a long vowel sound, so omega, eta, sometimes alpha, a lot of your diphthongs, ev and av. So if you have a long vowel sound, it cannot go as far back as what it originally could. Okay, so it's got to go back on one of these three. So if, for example, you have an acute here, it wants to go back to that syllable. It wants to go as close to the syllable as possible. So the next closest that is now open is this one. So we look at Filippo, okay? Let's talk firstly about Philippos. So Philippos and Philippon have an omicron in the ending. So the accent can go all the way back. It can go on to the third to last syllable. However, if you go to Filippo, now it has a long vowel. So now the acute can't go there. But the accent wants to go as close as it possibly can. So the next closest is going to be here. So it's going to sit there. Okay? And it wants to try its best to retain its original form. Now, let's take another example. Okay, let's take Petros, for example. Okay? Now this one is different. Okay? So Petros, now the accent falls on the second to last syllable. So Philippos, it was the third to last, but Petros is the second to last. Okay? So when we go from Petros to Petro, it's a long vowel sound, okay? But it can still retain its form. So it's just going to stay there. So it's not going to change at all. Okay? Now, this gets a little bit unique. So if it is on the last syllable, okay, so for example, theos, now if you go theos or theon, it's just going to keep the same accent. However, if you go to that long omega iota sound, you cannot keep the accent as an acute. The reason is because contraction's taking place there, okay? So you have that omega iota contraction. So to indicate contraction, you now need the circumflex. So the accent still stays there, but it changes from an acute to a circumflex. So some of these accent rules can be a lot for some people. If you're wanting to track it through a little bit, I'm just giving it to you piece by piece, okay? I'm trying to do the best I can to make sure that things are as simple as possible, but unfortunately the accent rules are probably the most complicated things in all of Greek. But really, if you understand basically this rule, this will carry you for most of the stuff to deal with accents. Okay, so this even happens with the verbs. Okay, so remember back in the verbs, so the difference between verbs and nouns is that nouns, the accent falls wherever it falls within a noun. So a noun's root word could have the accent on the last syllable, second to last, third to last. Okay. For verbs, the accent wants to go as far back as possible, okay? It wants to go as close to the front of the word as possible, so it's always going to want to be on the third or second to last syllable. It does not want to be on that last syllable if it can avoid it, okay? So the difference between nouns and verbs is that verbs, it's always going to fall on the second, on the third to last syllable if it's a short vowel, or the second to last syllable if it's a long vowel. So think, for example, philo. No, actually that's not a good example because that's a contraction form, but let's take akuo, for example, okay? So akuo, you have a long vowel, so it can't go here or here, and it wants to go as close to the beginning, so the closest it can get is here, okay? So this is the second to last syllable. It's going to be an acute there. Now let's take akuomen. Now the last syllable is now short, so now it can go on the third to last syllable, which just so happens to be the same syllable, okay? So that's generally what it wants to do. And with the contractions that take place as well, so if you take phileo, for example, it wants to do the same thing, but now because contraction's taken place, and it really wants to go over that epsilon because that epsilon is really the second to last syllable, but contraction's taken place, so you've got to have that circumflex. So it goes as far back as it can, but that vowel's not there, so it just needs to change a little bit. So verbs obviously can take accent on that last syllable because of contraction, but usually if it's on the last syllable, it's always going to have the circumflex because there's contraction taking place, and it wants to go on a vowel that's actually just before that last syllable but has merged into that last syllable. So it's a little bit complicated. I do get that, but it does make it a little bit helpful if you do understand the rules. I think the verbs are by far the easiest accent rules to learn. The nouns, because an accent can start on any of the syllables, that's what makes it a little bit tricky. And there are some other rules to be aware of as well, but generally speaking, these are the main rules to be aware of. Now, if you're not wanting to track the accents, ignore everything I've said, okay? But if you're wanting to learn them, these are the rules, and this is why I'm pointing it out, in case there are people that do want to follow the accent rules. So I'm hoping this is starting to make a bit of sense. You know, try and create some new sentences, write new sentences, try different combinations of different words, even if it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Just have a go using the different forms. And next video, we're going to look at a new form as well. Okay, so we'll see you in the next video.